Long before cars existed, the wealthiest people on Earth rode in vehicles worth more than most nations could afford. So, today I'm counting down 10 of the most extraordinary ancient vehicles ever built, and what they're worth now. Number 10. The Gold State Coach, and it's a rough ride. The first thing to understand about the Gold State Coach is that it was never designed for comfort. It was designed to be seen. Built in 1762 for King George III, it's been the centerpiece of every British coronation since. A rolling declaration that the British monarchy has more money than you could reasonably spend on a carriage, and the confidence to spend it anyway. The coach is 24 feet long and weighs somewhere between 4 and 5 tons. That's roughly the same as a fully loaded Range Rover, except this thing has no engine, no shock absorbers, and no apology for either. 8 horses pull it. The body hangs from leather straps rather than springs, which means every cobblestone, every slight gradient in the road, every gust of wind translates directly into a swaying, pitching, lurching experience for whoever is sitting inside. Queen Elizabeth II described the ride as horrible. She wasn't being dramatic. She was just being accurate. The exterior is gilded limewood, carved by Joseph Wilton, with painted panels by the Florentine artist Giovanni Cipriani. The gilding isn't decorative paint, it's actual gold leaf applied over the carved surface. The panels depict Britannia, figures of fame, the 4 corners of the earth. Every square inch is doing political work. This is not a vehicle. It's a moving argument about imperial power, and it's been making that argument for over 260 years. The current estimated value sits somewhere between 10 and 15 million pounds. And that's a conservative figure for an object that is genuinely irreplaceable. There is no market for the Gold State Coach because there is nothing else like it. You couldn't build one today for the same money. The craftsmen who made it, the techniques they used, the specific historical weight it carries, none of that has a price tag that makes clean sense. It has been used for the coronation of every British monarch since George IV in 1821. George III, who commissioned it, never actually rode in it for a coronation. He was already king when it was finished. So the coach was built for a king who didn't need it yet, and has since carried every king and queen who came after. The most recent outing was the coronation of King Charles III in May 2023. He rode in it despite the well-documented discomfort, which suggests either a deep commitment to tradition or a tolerance for rough travel that his mother apparently did not share. But here's the detail that tends to stop people. The coach has no suspension in any meaningful modern sense. The leather strap system was considered sophisticated engineering in 1762. By the standards of what it replaced, solid wooden axles, iron-rimmed wheels on stone, it was an improvement. By the standards of anything built in the last 100 years, it is essentially a gilded box on wheels, and the wheels do not forgive the road. Every monarch who has sat inside it has experienced the same ride. George IV, Victoria, Edward VII, George V, George VI, Elizabeth II, Charles III. The technology hasn't changed. The road has improved considerably, which is the only reason the journey from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey takes minutes rather than hours. The coach moves at walking pace. Police escort. The horses are managed by coachmen in full livery. The whole procession is choreographed down to the second, and at the center of it, swaying on leather straps, sits the most powerful person in the British constitutional system, holding on and hoping the route stays smooth. It rarely does. The Gold State Coach is currently housed in the Royal Mews at Buckingham Palace, where it can be viewed by the public. It is maintained in full working condition, which requires continuous conservation work on the gilding, the painted panels, and the structural timber. It is, by any reasonable measure, the most famous carriage in the world, and almost certainly the most uncomfortable one still in active use, which, for an object worth millions, is a remarkable achievement. 9. Tutankhamun's chariots, and they were actually used. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, he found 6 chariots, not models, not decorative objects placed there for symbolic reasons. 6 actual chariots disassembled and stacked in the antechamber and annex of the tomb, because the tomb's entrance corridor was too narrow to fit them whole. That detail matters. These weren't ceremonial props buried to look impressive. The wear patterns on the wheels, the axles, the harness fittings, they show real use. Tutankhamun, who died at roughly 19 years old, had actually ridden in these things, possibly hunted from them, possibly reviewed troops from them. The chariots went into the ground with him because they were his, in the same way his sandals and his gold death mask were his. 2 of the 6 are classified as state chariots. These are the ones covered in gold leaf, electrum, and glass inlay, with hunting scenes and images of enemies being trampled pressed into the decoration. They are visually extraordinary, not in a vague way, but in the specific way of objects where every surface has been worked by hand to a standard that took years of training to achieve. The other 4 are hunting and military chariots, lighter, less decorated, built for speed rather than spectacle. And here's where the engineering becomes genuinely striking. These chariots were designed to be light enough for a pair of horses to pull at speed, strong enough to survive the jolting impact of rough terrain, and flexible enough to absorb shocks without breaking. The wheel spokes are cut from a single piece of wood, bent into shape using heat and moisture, then dried into position. The rawhide lashing that binds the joints is not a backup. It's structural. It's doing the work that metal bolts would do in a later vehicle. When it dries tight, it holds like iron, and it's lighter than iron by a significant margin. Modern engineers and archaeologists who have built replica chariots using ancient techniques found that the design is, by the standards of its time, close to optimal. There isn't much you'd change if you were trying to solve the same problem. Fast, light, durable, horse-drawn, with the same materials available in Egypt around 1300 BC. The estimated combined value of the 6 chariots as archaeological artifacts runs into the tens of millions of dollars. The state chariots alone, if they were ever to appear on the open market, which they won't, because they're Egyptian national treasures housed in the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, would individually command prices that would make major auction houses stop and pay attention. The gold content alone is significant. The historical significance is incalculable in any honest sense of the word. But yeah, the gold is almost a distraction from the engineering. The spoked wheel, at the time these chariots were built, was a relatively recent technology. The Egyptians had adopted it from contacts further north and east, refined it, and by the time of Tutankhamun's reign were producing wheels with 6 spokes, a design that distributes load more efficiently than the 4-spoke wheels that came before it. 6 spokes. 3,300 years ago, in a vehicle light enough that one person could carry a wheel under their arm. The chariots were reassembled after Carter's team documented them, a process that took years because the tomb excavation itself was methodical to a degree that was unusual for the era. Carter worked the tomb from 1922 to 1932, 10 years. The chariots were among the last major objects to be fully processed and conserved. They now sit in the Grand Egyptian Museum, which opened its main galleries in 2023. The state chariots are displayed in conditions that control humidity and light to prevent further degradation of the organic materials, the wood, the leather, the linen wrappings on some of the components. The wheels still have their original tires, not rubber. Leather stretched wet over the wooden rim and stitched tight, then left to dry and shrink into place. A technique that works. A technique that held for over 3,000 years in a sealed tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And when Carter's team first found them, the leather was still supple enough to identify the stitching pattern. At number 8, Napoleon's Berlin, captured at Waterloo. On the night of June the 18th, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte fled the battlefield at Waterloo in his personal traveling carriage. He left in such haste that he abandoned everything inside it. His maps, his correspondence, his gold toiletry set, a diamond necklace worth a significant fortune, and a strongbox containing his personal jewels and a substantial amount of cash. The Prussians caught the carriage a short time later. The strongbox was still locked, still full. That carriage was the Berlin, and it is one of the most documented, most fought over, and most traveled vehicles of the 19th century. Napoleon had it built specifically for campaign use, which meant it had to function as something more than transport. The interior was fitted with a fold-out bed, a writing desk, map drawers, compartments for documents, a small library of books, and the gold toiletry set. Razors, brushes, bottles, all monogrammed, all custom made. When the Berlin was moving, Napoleon was working. He could eat, sleep, read dispatches, dictate letters, and plan military operations without stopping, without dismounting, without losing time to the basic logistics of being a human being who needs rest. The carriage itself weighed roughly 2.5 tons. 6 horses pulled it at speed. It was built low to the ground for stability on rough roads, with a suspension system designed to reduce, not eliminate, reduce the impact of unpaved surfaces across a continent that didn't have many paved ones. It was, in effect, a mobile command center, not a luxury vehicle that happened to travel. A functional military and administrative tool that happened to be extremely well appointed. The Prussians who captured it understood immediately what they had. The carriage was paraded through Prussia as a trophy. Its contents were catalogued and dispersed, some items kept by Prussian officers, some eventually returned or sold, some simply lost. The carriage itself was exhibited publicly. People paid to walk past it and look at the thing that had carried the most powerful man in Europe right up until the moment he wasn't. Wellington eventually acquired it. The Berline was brought to England and displayed at Madame Tussauds in London, where it remained for years as one of the most popular exhibits. Then, in 1845, Madame Tussauds suffered a major fire. The Berline was destroyed, so the carriage that survives, the one now held at Apsley House, the Wellington Museum in London, is not the Waterloo Berline. It is a different Napoleon campaign carriage also built to the same specifications also used during the campaign period. Apsley House is clear about this. The Waterloo Berline is gone. But yeah, the surviving carriage is still a direct physical connection to how Napoleon actually traveled and worked. The map drawers are real. The compartment design is real. The scale of the thing, long enough that a man could lie flat, wide enough for a desk and 2 people to sit opposite each other, tells you something specific about how Napoleon organized his time and his mind. If you're enjoying the video, drop a like and a comment. It really does help the channel out. And stay with us, because the vehicles coming up make Napoleon's campaign carriage look modest. The estimated value of surviving Napoleon campaign carriages at auction runs into the millions of pounds. A different Napoleon carriage, his state coach, sold at auction in Paris in 2014 for 2.4 million euros, which was considered a reasonable price for what it was. Campaign carriages, being more directly connected to specific military events, tend to command more. The Apsley House carriage is not for sale. It is part of the National Collection, maintained by English Heritage, and displayed in the context of Wellington's personal collection of Napoleonic material, which is by any measure one of the most concentrated collections of objects connected to a single military conflict anywhere in the world. Wellington kept everything. Portraits of Napoleon, sculpture, captured weapons, the carriage. He kept it all, displayed it, and lived surrounded by it for the rest of his life in the house that the grateful British nation gave him after Waterloo. There's something in that. The man who defeated Napoleon spent the next 40 years living with Napoleon's things. 7. The Concord Stagecoach. It opened the American West. Concord, New Hampshire, 1827. A coach-building firm called Abbott Downing starts producing a vehicle that will, within a few decades, become the most recognizable piece of transport infrastructure in the United States. Not the railroad, not the river barge, the stagecoach. Specifically, this stagecoach. The Concorde's defining feature isn't its size or its speed. It's the thoroughbrace, a system of thick leather straps, stacked and riveted, that the body of the coach hangs from rather than sitting on. Other coaches of the era use metal springs. Metal springs transmit shock. They bounce. The thoroughbrace absorbs it, distributing the energy of a rough road into a long, slow rocking motion rather than a sharp vertical jolt. The result is a ride that Mark Twain, who took one across Nevada in 1861, described as being like a cradle on wheels. He didn't mean it entirely as a compliment. But the physics were sound. The body itself was built from white oak, basswood, and white ash, each chosen for a specific structural role. The panels were painted in a deep red or yellow ochre, depending on the customer's order, with decorative scenes sometimes added to the door panels. The hardware was iron. The wheels were wooden with iron tires, the rims heated and fitted hot so they'd shrink tight as they cooled. A standard Concorde weighed around 2,500 pounds, roughly the same as a modern compact car, but with no engine and a team of up to 6 horses doing the work. It could carry 9 passengers inside, seated 3 to a bench across 3 rows, and up to 12 more on the roof and the driver's box. The interior was not generous. 9 people across 3 bench seats for a journey that might last several days, over roads that were frequently not roads at all. But yeah, it worked. And the reason it worked is that Abbott Downing built it to last. The thoroughbrace system meant the structural frame wasn't absorbing constant shock the way a spring-mounted coach would. The joints held. The wheels held. Coaches that went into service in the 1850s were still running in the 1880s, 30 years later, on routes that covered thousands of miles a year. Wells Fargo alone operated hundreds of Concorde coaches across the American West. The company became so associated with the vehicle that the image of a Concorde stagecoach became shorthand for Wells Fargo itself, a branding association that the company has maintained in various forms ever since. The coach appeared on bank signage, on advertising, on the side of buildings. It was the logo before logos were a formal concept. The routes these coaches covered were not short. The Butterfield Overland Mail Route, which ran from 1858 to 1861, stretched roughly 2,800 miles from Missouri to San Francisco, about the same distance as London to Tehran. Coaches ran day and night, changing horses at stations every 10 to 15 miles. Passengers didn't stop. The mail didn't stop. The schedule was the schedule. Abbott Downing exported the Concorde design to Australia, South Africa, South America, and parts of Europe. Over 30 countries eventually ordered them. The total number built over the company's production run runs into the thousands, though exact figures are difficult to confirm because record keeping at the time was inconsistent. Surviving original Concorde stagecoaches in good condition are now museum pieces. When they come to auction, which is rare, they sell for between $300,000 and over $1 million, depending on provenance and condition. A coach with a documented Wells Fargo history commands a premium. A coach that can be traced to a specific named route commands more still. The Concorde didn't just carry passengers, it carried mail, gold, payroll, and the general assumption that the Western United States was a place where regular scheduled transport was possible. That assumption turned out to be load-bearing. The stagecoach routes established the corridors that the railroads later followed, and the towns that grew up around the relay stations became the towns that are still there. The vehicle that Abbott Downing built in a New Hampshire workshop in 1827 drew the map of the American West. Not intentionally, not as a plan, just by going back and forth reliably for 30 years. Number 6, Charles X's coronation coach, the last of its kind. In the gallery of coaches at the Palace of Versailles, there is a vehicle that took 3 years to build, cost the equivalent of tens of millions in today's money, and was used exactly once. Charles X rode it to his coronation at Reims Cathedral on the 29th of May, 1825. 5 years later, he was deposed. The coach outlasted the monarchy it was built to celebrate, which is either ironic or entirely predictable, depending on how closely you've been paying attention to French history. The coach is not subtle. Nothing about it was meant to be. The exterior is covered in sculpted and gilded bronze fittings, painted panels depicting allegorical scenes of royal virtue, and upholstery in silk velvet embroidered with gold thread. The roof carries a crown. The door panels carry the royal arms. Every surface is making the same argument. This is what legitimate power looks like, and legitimate power is expensive, and you should feel that in your bones when you look at it. That was the point. Not transport, argument. The French coronation coach tradition had been interrupted by the Revolution and the Napoleonic period. Napoleon had his own coronation in 1804, but he used a different vehicle and a very different ceremony, one that was more Roman imperial than French royal in its references. Charles X was the first Bourbon king to have a traditional coronation since Louis XVI in 1775, and the coach was built to signal that the old order had returned, fully, visibly, at enormous expense. The craftsmanship involved is worth dwelling on. The bronze fittings were cast individually, chased by hand, and gilded using the mercury gilding process, a technique that produces a depth and warmth of color that electroplating, which replaced it later in the 19th century, cannot fully replicate. Mercury gilding is also acutely toxic, which is why it was eventually banned, and why the craftsmen who produced the Charles X coach were working under conditions that would not pass any modern safety standard by a significant margin. The painted panels were executed by leading artists of the period. The silk embroidery on the interior required specialist workshops that had been producing this kind of work for the French court since the reign of Louis XIV. The whole project was, in effect, a mobilization of the French luxury trades, a deliberate demonstration that France still had the craftsmen, the workshops, and the institutional knowledge to produce objects of this quality. So, the coach is also a document. It tells you what France could still do in 1825 and what it thought was worth doing. Charles X was the last king of France to be crowned in the traditional manner. His successor, Louis Philippe, took the throne after the July Revolution of 1830 without a coronation at all. The coach had no successor because the ceremony had no successor. It was built for a ritual that was performed once more and then never again. The coach survives in the Versailles collection, where it is displayed alongside the other great carriages of the French royal family, including the coronation coaches of earlier reigns. In that context, the Charles X's coach is simultaneously the most recent and the final entry in a tradition that stretched back centuries, the newest, and the last. Current valuation for an object of this type, unique, historically specific, in the collection of a major national institution, doesn't really work in conventional auction terms. Versailles is not selling it. But comparable objects from the French royal collection that have come to market have achieved prices in the range of several million euros, and the Charles X coach, with its direct connection to the last traditional French coronation, would command considerably more than comparable. The 5 years between the coronation and the deposition give the coach a particular quality that purely ceremonial objects don't usually have. It was built at the absolute peak of Bourbon confidence, in the belief that the monarchy was restored and stable and would endure. The revolution that ended Charles X's reign came quickly enough that the coach had barely been returned to storage before the political ground shifted entirely. 3 years to build, 1 day of use, 200 years of survival. 5. The bronze chariots of the terracotta army, 4,000 individual bronze components, cast, assembled, and buried in 210 BC to serve an emperor who was already dead. The 2 bronze chariots found in the pit adjacent to the main terracotta army site at Sienne are not full-size vehicles. That's the correction that matters here. They are half-scale replicas, each one roughly half the dimensions of a real working chariot, built entirely from bronze, gold, and silver, with no iron and no wood. Every component that would have been leather on a real chariot is bronze here, cast thin enough to suggest the flexibility of the original material without actually being flexible. The canopy frame over the rear chariot, the covered one, the one designed for Qin Shi Huang's spirit to travel in, has struts thinner than a modern pencil, cast in bronze to submillimeter tolerances. Think about that for a moment. Submillimeter bronze casting in 210 BC, using clay molds and charcoal furnaces. The rear chariot, known as chariot number 2 or the high chariot, is the more elaborate of the pair. It has a domed canopy, not a flat roof, a dome with a slightly convex profile that would shed rain on a real vehicle, supported by a frame of bronze struts. The interior has windows that open and close using a sliding mechanism. Bronze windows, with functioning hardware, on a half-scale model built to accompany a dead emperor into the afterlife. The 4 horses pulling each chariot are modeled anatomically, not stylized, not symbolic, anatomically. The musculature of the neck and shoulder, the structure of the hoof, the way the harness sits across the chest, all of it observed and rendered in bronze with a precision that required either direct study of living horses or access to detailed visual references that no longer survive. Each horse stands roughly 1 meter tall at the shoulder, half the height of the real animals they represent. The harness hardware is fully functional at half scale. The bits, the rings, the traces. If you scaled these objects up to full size, the hardware would work. It was designed to work. The craftsmen who made it weren't simplifying for the sake of a model. They were building the real thing at a different size. Both chariots were found broken, crushed under the weight of the collapsed pit ceiling, shattered into roughly 3,000 pieces between them. Archaeologists spent years reassembling them, working from fragments, using the internal logic of the design to determine what went where. The restoration took over 8 years for the two vehicles combined. The result is what's now displayed in a dedicated museum at the CN site, two of the most technically sophisticated bronze objects from the ancient world, displayed in a purpose-built climate-controlled facility because the bronze alloy is sensitive enough to humidity that uncontrolled air could accelerate corrosion. The gold and silver detailing is not decorative in the loose sense. It's applied to specific components, the canopy fittings, the harness rings, the driver's equipment, in patterns that correspond to the rank markings of actual imperial equipment. This is not a generic chariot, it's a replica of the specific type of vehicle the emperor used, marked with the specific insignia of imperial rank, built to the specific half scale that was apparently the standard for this kind of burial object in the Qin period. The value of these objects as archaeological artifacts is, in practical terms, not calculable. China classifies them as first-grade national treasures, which means they cannot be sold, cannot leave China permanently, and are subject to restrictions on travel even for exhibition purposes. When comparable bronze objects from the ancient Chinese world have appeared at auction, smaller pieces, less significant, without this provenance, they have achieved prices in the range of several $1,000,000. The terracotta army chariots exist in a category where the concept of market value stops being useful. What the craftsmen who built them understood, and what still surprises metallurgists who study them, is that the bronze alloy composition varies across different components of the same chariot. The struts use a different alloy ratio than the fittings. The wheels use a different ratio than the canopy frame. Each component's alloy was tuned to the mechanical demands of that specific part. That's not primitive metalworking, that's materials engineering. Catherine the Great's winter carriage. Number 4. Russia. In the 1760s is not a country you cross lightly. The distances between major cities are measured not in hours but in days, and the terrain between them, frozen steppe, forest roads that dissolve into mud in spring and refreeze into ruts in autumn, is not hospitable to wheeled vehicles for a significant portion of the year. Catherine the Great understood this. Her solution was not to travel less, it was to bring the court with her. The winter carriage built for Catherine during her reign is, by any reasonable measure, a mobile palace. Not in the loose metaphorical sense that people apply to large vehicles. Literally, it contained a study, a bedroom, and a space that functioned as a reception room, all within the body of a single carriage. The interior was fitted with a small library, a writing desk, upholstered seating for multiple occupants, and heating, because Russia in winter does not forgive vehicles that forget to account for the cold. The exterior dimensions required a team of up to 30 horses to move it across snow and ice. 30 horses, roughly the pulling capacity needed to haul a loaded freight container up a moderate incline, applied to a vehicle carrying one empress and her immediate attendants. The carriage didn't travel on wheels in winter. It was fitted to runners, converting it to a sledge for the frozen months, and back to wheels when the ground thawed. This is the detail that tends to stop people. The vehicle was designed to be reconfigured seasonally. The body stayed the same. The running gear changed. It was, in effect, two vehicles sharing one very expensive interior. Catherine used the carriage, and others like it, used for her famous inspection tours of Russia, including the celebrated journey to Crimea in 1787, which became one of the most discussed and debated royal progresses of the 18th century. The journey covered thousands of miles and took months. Foreign ambassadors and dignitaries joined sections of the route. Audiences were granted inside the carriage mid-journey to officials who rode alongside and were admitted for formal meetings while the procession continued moving. So the carriage was not just transport, it was the court, relocated. The political business of running the Russian Empire continued inside it at the same pace and with the same formality as it would have in St. Petersburg. Ministers presented documents. Decisions were made. The carriage had decided in effect that geography was not a reason to stop governing. The craftsmanship of Catherine's state vehicles reflected the ambition of her court. She imported European craftsmen, French coach builders, German woodworkers, Italian decorative artists, and established workshops in St. Petersburg capable of producing vehicles that could compete with anything being made in Paris or Vienna. The lacquered exteriors, the gilded fittings, the silk and velvet interiors, all of it executed to a standard that was intended to signal to any foreign visitor who saw it that Russia was not a provincial court on the edge of Europe. It was a major power with the material culture to prove it. Several of Catherine's carriages survive in the collection of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. They are among the most significant objects in the museum's applied arts holdings, not because they are the most decorated, though some of them are extraordinarily so, but because they are functional documents of how power actually operated in 18th century Russia. The carriage wasn't the symbol of Catherine's authority, it was the mechanism of it. Valuation for objects of this type from the Russian imperial collection is complicated by the fact that the Hermitage is not selling anything, and comparable pieces from the Russian imperial decorative arts tradition that have come to auction have achieved widely varying prices depending on provenance and condition. A Catherine period state sledge sold at a European auction in the early 2000s for a price in the low millions. The larger and more historically significant carriages in the Hermitage collection would command considerably more, in the unlikely event they were ever offered. But yeah, the number that stays with you isn't the auction estimate. It's the 30 horses, 30 animals, harnessed in sequence, moving a bedroom and a throne room and a foreign policy apparatus across a frozen continent. Catherine the Great died in 1796, having transformed Russia's borders, its institutions, and its position in European politics. She did a significant portion of that work from inside a moving carriage. 3. The Lord Mayor's coach, still rolling after 260 years. 1757. The City of London commissions a state coach for its Lord Mayor. The craftsmen finish it, the Lord Mayor rides in it for the first time, and then, without interruption, without a single year missed, it goes out every November for the Lord Mayor's show, every year since. For 266 years and counting. That's not a ceremonial object that survived, that's a working vehicle that refused to stop working. The coach was designed by the artist Sir Robert Taylor with carved panels painted by Giovanni Cipriani, the same Cipriani who would paint the panels on the Gold State coach 5 years later in 1762. So, the same artist, the same decade, 2 different coaches, both still in active use today. Cipriani's painted panels depict allegorical figures representing the virtues and achievements of civic London, fame, riches, plenty, and the city itself as a figure receiving tribute. The panels are oil on canvas, set into carved and gilded frames on the coach body. The coach is 27 feet long. That's roughly the length of a London double-decker bus, but narrower, taller, and considerably more gilded. It weighs 3 tons, 6,000 pounds of carved wood, iron fittings, gilded decoration, and painted canvas, pulled by 6 Shire horses in full ceremonial harness. There is no suspension in any functional modern sense. The body hangs from leather braces, which soften the motion slightly, but the coach doesn't really absorb the road. It negotiates with it, badly, and the road usually wins. The carved decoration covers almost every external surface: figures, foliage, shields, maritime symbols. The City of London's wealth came from trade, and the coach makes that argument in 3 dimensions across every panel and pillar. The gilding is not paint. It's gold leaf applied over a base of red clay called bole, which gives the gold a warmth and depth that paint cannot replicate. The gilding has been restored multiple times over the centuries, but the carved limewood structure beneath it is largely original. Limewood, that's the material. Not oak, not mahogany. Limewood, chosen because it carves cleanly and holds fine detail without splitting. The craftsmen who built the coach used the same material and the same techniques that Grinling Gibbons had established as the standard for high-end English decorative carving in the previous century. The Lord Mayor's coach is, among other things, a document of what English wood carving could do at its peak in the mid-18th century. The interior is upholstered in scarlet velvet, with painted ceiling panels and gilded moldings. It seats the Lord Mayor and a small number of accompanying dignitaries. The windows are glazed, real glass, set in frames that can be opened. In November in London, with 6 horses pulling at walking pace through city streets, the glass is usually closed. Every year, the coach requires significant conservation work before the show. The gilding is checked and touched up where needed. The painted panels are examined for cracking or flaking. The leather braces are inspected. The ironwork is checked. The horse's harness is cleaned and dressed. The whole vehicle is, in effect, restored to working condition annually, then used once, then put back into conservation storage until the following year. The City of London Corporation owns the coach and maintains it at the Museum of London Docklands, where it is displayed when not in use. The conservation costs alone, accumulated over the decades, represent a substantial ongoing investment in keeping a 266-year-old vehicle roadworthy. Valuation is not straightforward for an object of this type. It is not for sale, has never been for sale, and is classified as part of the city's historic collection. But the combination of age, continuous documented use, historical significance, and artistic quality, Cipriani panels alone would command serious attention at auction, places it in a category of objects where the value is effectively set by uniqueness, rather than by comparable sales. No comparable exists. There is no other civic state coach of this age in continuous annual use anywhere in the world. The Lord Mayor's show itself dates to the 13th century, making it one of the oldest civic processions in continuous existence. The coach joined that procession in 1757 and has not missed a year since. Wars, coronations, pandemics, the show has continued and the coach has continued with it. November, every year, 6 horses, walking pace. The Roman racing chariot. Number 2, under 25 kilograms. That's the weight of the vehicle itself. Less than a modern bicycle, less than a carry-on suitcase packed for a 2-week trip. 4 horses, no seat, an open back, and a driver who wrapped the reins around his waist so he could use his full body weight to steer, and carried a knife on his belt specifically to cut himself free if he went down and the horses kept running. This is the quadriga, and it was the Formula One of the ancient world. Except the money involved makes modern motorsport look restrained. The Circus Maximus in Rome held up to 250,000 spectators, not a stadium. A city within a city, dedicated entirely to chariot racing, built in a valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills and expanded over centuries until it reached a length of around 600 meters, roughly 6 football pitches end to end. Races ran 7 laps of the central spine called the spina, which was decorated with obelisks, statues, and lap counters. The total distance per race was approximately 5 kilometers. Drivers completed it at speeds that could reach up to 60 kilometers per hour on the straights. The chariot itself was called a biga if pulled by 2 horses, a quadriga if pulled by 4. The quadriga was the prestige class, faster, more dangerous, more watched. The body was a shallow curved platform, open at the back, made from lightweight wood and leather. The wheel hubs were bronze. The axle ran the full width of the vehicle and the driver stood directly over it, weight centered, reins wrapped and locked, moving with the vehicle rather than against it. The turns were the kill zone. The spina's ends, called the metae, were marked by 3 conical posts, and drivers had to bring 4 horses around them at speed with a vehicle that had no brakes and a turning radius that demanded the inside horse to almost stop while the outside horse kept running. Crashes at the metae were frequent, spectacular, and often fatal. The Latin term for a crash, naufragium, literally shipwreck, tells you how the Romans understood what they were watching. And then there's the money. This is where the numbers stop making comfortable sense. Gaius Apuleius Diocles was a charioteer from Lusitania, modern Portugal, who raced in Rome in the 2nd century AD. He competed for 24 years, drove for 4 of the major racing factions, and retired at the age of 42. His recorded career winnings totaled 35,863,120 sesterces. Historians who have attempted to translate this into modern purchasing power, accounting for what that sum could buy in terms of grain, labor, and land, have arrived at figures in the range of $15 billion. Not 15 million, 15 billion. He was not an anomaly in kind, only in scale. Top charioteers across the Roman period earned at a level that dwarfed senators, military commanders, and provincial governors. The factions, the blues, greens, reds, and whites, were effectively professional sports franchises with stables, trainers, veterinarians, equipment managers, and talent scouts. Successful drivers were celebrities in the modern sense, recognized in the street, depicted in mosaics, commemorated in inscriptions. Diocles has a surviving inscription erected by his fans that lists his career statistics in the kind of granular detail that would not look out of place on a modern sports statistics website. The vehicles themselves, the actual racing chariots, have not survived. Wood and leather don't last 2,000 years in the open air, and the Circus Maximus was not a museum. What survives are depictions, mosaics, reliefs, pottery, coins. From these, engineers and historians have reconstructed the design with reasonable confidence. Several replica quadrigi have been built in the modern era, and test drives, if that's the right word, confirm what the ancient sources describe. The vehicle is extraordinarily responsive and extraordinarily unforgiving. Small inputs produce large results. Mistakes at speed produce the naufragium. The chariot had no interest in keeping its driver alive. It was optimized for one thing, speed around a track, and everything else, including the survival of the person standing on it, was a secondary consideration. Diocles survived 24 years of that, retired, presumably walked away. That really hasn't changed either. Sport has always reserved its largest rewards for the people willing to accept the terms the vehicle sets. The most sophisticated state coach ever built. Number 1. Built in Australia, delivered to Buckingham Palace in 2014, contains fragments of HMS Victory's timber, iron from a First World War battleship, and stone from the original Palace of Westminster, all embedded structurally into the body of the coach itself, and it's the only British state coach in history fitted with hydraulic suspension. That last detail is why it's number 1, not the embedded history, the suspension. The Diamond Jubilee State Coach was commissioned to mark the 60th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's accession. The Australian coach builder Jim Frecklington spent over a decade designing and constructing it, working with a small team in Queensland. The project was not a restoration, it was not a replica. It was an attempt to build a state coach from first principles, to ask what a ceremonial vehicle should actually do in the 21st century, and then build something that did it. Every other British state coach on this list was built before the internal combustion engine existed, before hydraulic engineering was a practical option, before anyone had seriously reconsidered whether hanging a gilded box from leather straps was the best available solution to the problem of moving a monarch through a city. The Diamond Jubilee coach asked the question, then it answered it. The hydraulic suspension system works by allowing each wheel to respond independently to the road surface, absorbing vertical movement before it reaches the body of the coach. The body stays level, the occupant stays level. The gilded exterior moves through the street with the same ceremonial gravity as any other state coach, and the person inside does not feel the cobblestones. This sounds like a small thing. It isn't. Every monarch who rode in the Gold State Coach, and we established at the start of this video exactly what that experience involves, was managing the physical reality of a vehicle that amplifies the road rather than absorbing it. The Diamond Jubilee Coach solved that problem, completely. For the first time in the history of British state transport, the embedded historical materials are worth understanding precisely because the description fragments of history undersells what was actually done. Timber from HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar in 1805, was incorporated into the coachwork. Iron from a First World War battleship is worked into the structure. Stone from the Palace of Westminster, the original medieval palace that burned in 1834, is set into the interior. These are not decorative inclusions. They are load-bearing or structurally integrated materials, chosen because the coach was conceived as a repository of British history as well as a functional vehicle. The painted panels depict scenes from across the reign of Elizabeth II. The upholstery uses silk woven in Britain. The gilding follows traditional techniques. From the outside, at ceremonial distance, it reads as a state coach, appropriately grand, appropriately formal, continuous with the tradition it belongs to. From the inside, it rides like a different century entirely. Charles III chose the Diamond Jubilee coach for his coronation procession in May 2023, passing over the Gold State coach that has been used for every coronation since George IV. The decision was reported at the time as partly practical. The king is in his mid-70s, and the Gold State coach's ride quality is not something you'd choose if you had an alternative. He had an alternative. The Gold State coach made the return journey from Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace, empty. The Diamond Jubilee coach carried the king and queen. Valuation for the Diamond Jubilee coach is not publicly confirmed, but the construction cost alone, a decade of skilled labor, specialist materials, hydraulic engineering, historical artifacts incorporated into the structure, runs into the millions of pounds. As a unique object with a direct connection to two reigning monarchs and a documented role in a coronation, its value as a historical artifact compounds with time rather than depreciating. In 50 years, it will be what the Gold State coach is now: irreplaceable, priceless in the non-metaphorical sense, and maintained at continuous expense by an institution that has no choice but to keep it. The Gold State coach is 262 years old and still in service. The Diamond Jubilee coach is 11 years old and has already carried a king to his coronation. But here's the detail that closes this out. Jim Frecklington, the coach builder who spent over a decade constructing it in Queensland, did not use computer-aided design for the structural elements. He worked from drawings, by hand, using techniques that would have been recognizable to the craftsman who built the Gold State coach in 1762, and then added hydraulic suspension because there was no reason not to. The oldest methods and the newest engineering in the same vehicle, on the same streets, without making the monarch feel like they're being tossed in a rough sea. If you thought these vehicles were valuable, wait till you see our video on the world's most expensive royal treasures ever sold. Click here and I'll see you over there.